All right, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Left to Chat. Today we are continuing our discussion of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1. We're continuing today with Chapter 14, titled The Division of Labor and Manufacture. Just to give a little recap, in Chapter 12, remember we learned about relative surplus value, and that is the surplus value that's created by shortening necessary labor time and therefore decreasing the value of labor power. And that's done by, which we'll learn a lot today in Chapter 14, by devaluing and de-skilling the workers. And then in Chapter 13, we learned that the capitalist mode of production specifically begins when a large number of workers are assembled in a single place to work cooperatively, right? So today we're discussing Chapter 14, which really examines the divisions of labor both under a capitalist system, but Marx also talks a little bit about, which will bring up the social division of labor, how, which precedes the capitalist division of labor, the division of labor under manufacture. So just off the bat, for the division of labor to occur, kind of like what I mentioned as far as cooperativeness, is a large number of workers need to be assembled in that same place. So this chapter is broken up into 5 sections, and then in section 1 and 2, Marx kind of describes in detail what he calls manufacturing, and then how laborers become specialized, or in other words, they become kind of de-skilled, right? So manufacturing relies on the reorganization of existing handicrafts, existing skills, existing tool technologies into this new system. And he lays out these 2 ways that this can be done. So either there's a bunch of workers doing a bunch of different tasks, or a bunch of workers doing the same task. And I'll just run through that really quick and then throw it over to Steve. So with regards to that first way, Marx says, by assembling together in one workshop under the control of a single capitalist of workers belonging to various independent handicrafts, through whose hands a given article must pass on its way to completion. And the example it gives here is the task of carriage making, right? So horse and carriage, whoever makes the carriage. And so a lot of workers are doing a bunch of different tasks. Somebody makes the wheels, somebody makes whatever, the different aspects of it. And a bunch of people doing little tasks to create the carriage, and then somebody in the end assembles it, right? So that second way, Marx says that manufacture can also arise in exactly the opposite way. One capitalist simultaneously employs in one workshop a number of craftsmen who all do the same work or the same kind of work, such as making paper, type, or needles. This is cooperation in its simplest form. So this form is a lot of workers doing same type tasks, such as like on an assembly line. It could be considered the assembly line mode of production. And in this mode of production, the workers lose their individuality and become machine-like, making them more replaceable and their labor power cheaper for the capitalist. Steve?
Yeah, so, I think the gist of this chapter is mostly talking about how workers lose their autonomy, essentially. When you think about different kind of ways that people can make a living, you have like your independent kind of tradesmen, your plumbers, your electricians and stuff like that, who become like very skilled at doing kind of a variety of tasks. If you're an electrician, you're not necessarily only working on cars, you're working on in houses, you're working on power lines, you're working on in factories and ships or whatever, right? It's a very broad skill set, and therefore commands a very pretty high wage and stuff, and makes you able to subsist a lot easier, but it also makes you again, your labor is more highly valued, and also you're a little more difficult to control, which is something that Marx delves into a little deeper later in the chapter. But I think at the beginning, I think the thing to keep in mind is just the fact that the capitalist is trying to figure out a way to reduce your power, so that he can reduce your wage. And he's doing that by saying, well, you're no longer required to know all of these different things. You only really need to know how to put this little widget through this hole, and you're going to do that 8 hours a day, and that's all I need you to do. And since it's such a simple task, I don't really need to pay you that much money to do it.
Right. And yeah, out of those 2 forms, I guess the first form seems a little more rewarding, I guess, because everybody's doing like separate tasks to create an end product, versus that second form where it's more assembly line like, and everybody's just doing the same monotonous task all day. But whether it's the first form or the second form, each of those 2 forms increase this specialization of laborers, and essentially it narrows down their skill set and makes them less valuable and more replaceable, I guess.
And I thought one little interesting tidbit that Harvey mentions, and that I think it's on page, looks like notes at 468, that this kind of drive, I guess he starts talking about mechanics a little bit in machine, but I just thought it was interesting. He mentions this chapter how capital during this time, began to appropriate science and technology and engineering a lot more, and drove innovations in those fields and created the field of mechanics because they were trying to look for ways to capitalize and replace variable capital with constant capital, and that kind of drive to do that drove them to kind of push forward this field of science and stuff. So in a way, kind of to the thing that capitalists are always saying, oh, capital is innovative, you know what I mean? And in a way it is, but it's driven by these kind of corrosive social relations.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of relates to how Marx kind of even has admitted that in order for like this socialist future, this communist future to arise, it's required first this like groundwork that capital has put forth, right? Like it's kind of that whole synthesis antisynthesis dialectical formation.
Right.
So yeah, he was never very headstrong on like capitalism is bad, and but he's kind of admitting to an extent that we kind of needed capitalism in order for us to move past it, right?
Right.
I guess that's kind of how past economic systems have worked. I mean, we've come a long way since feudal times, and capitalism kind of evolved out of feudal times and out of slavery. So just those first two sections, kind of like you talked about, kind of the whole theme of the chapter, we're talking about workers, instead of having this freedom to move from one activity to another, they're increasingly locked into this particular skill or this particular handicraft, and using these particularly set of specialized tools, and they lose their individuality over it, right? So Marx says on page 458 that a worker who performs the same simple operation for the whole of his life converts his body into the automatic one-sided implement of that operation. And he also uses a lot of this analogy of like organs in a body, right? I think through this chapter, and how workers are all these different organs, appendages.
I think he uses,
to the body of the manufacturing,
the body of the machine, man.
Yeah. So yeah, the other thing, I think we mentioned once before that in the previous chapters, how not only does the worker need to be specialized, but those tools that he uses need to be specialized also. So it begs the question, is the worker in control of the tool, or is the tool in control of the worker? And that's a question that Harvey brings up. Something else that is also mentioned in sections 1 and 2 is how capital doesn't like gaps in the working day, right? Since in a previous chapter, Marx mentions that moments are the elements of profit, and these gaps close up, right? When one person, he says, these gaps close up when he is tied to the same operation the whole day long. And on the other hand, this can be counterproductive because constant labor of one uniform kind disturbs the intensity and flow of a man's vital forces, which finds recreation and delight in the change of activity itself. So this is what I mentioned in the previous chapter, and something as far as Richard Wolff's book, Democracy at Work, and something he kind of brings up. Rather than people being stuck in doing the same job all day or for the entire week or the entire month or the entire year, whatever, Wolff's proposal in Democracy at Work, which is about transitioning to worker cooperatives, is this mode of economic formation where people transition to different jobs, or like they kind of change off in different jobs. And I mean, it's more complicated. It would require people to be educated and trained in these different fields, but it gives people, I guess, more sense of worth and importance in the company. If maybe 1 month they're working on, let's say if it's an assembly line, whatever, but then another month they are in a more managerial position. So I just want to mention how that little tidbit of what Marx is talking about is kind of something, and Wolff being a Marxist, kind of something he addresses in his proposed Democracy at Work project, right?
Yeah, I like that. I like that. A couple of things there is, it's kind of funny. You almost have like two kind of competing, almost psychological ideas there. One of them is the idea of like, well, if I'm constantly switching from one task to the other, I'm like context switching in my mind, right? So like I lose some productivity that way because I'm doing one thing and I'm concentrating on doing one thing, and then all of a sudden I get prodded by something else. Like in modern times, if, imagine when you're editing videos or if I'm programming or something, and then all of a sudden somebody emails me or calls me or something. All of a sudden my mind context switches and I have to like write my email or do something or whatever, right? Or something happens and it's, your brain stops focusing on the thing that you were focusing on and starts focusing on something else. And those context switches that you have to do kind of affect your flow, so to speak, and your productivity. So that's kind of like a downside, but the upside though is that if you're you don't get bored, if you don't get stuck getting bored if you're doing the same thing over and over again, if you kind of have the ability to switch what you're doing throughout the day, or I guess in your idea, like maybe over time, like you would work 6 months in a farm, and then the other 6 months maybe you are working on I don't know, in some I don't know, mining or something.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean, which is kind of reminds you of this idea, this Ursula Le Guin book that I read a long time ago. I can't remember the damn name of it right now. Slips my mind, but essentially it's about this kind of future anarchist society, and in that society, as you're basically part of the day you're working for the community. So you don't get to pick that job. Like you're working like 2 or 3 hours, maybe I think it was maximum 4 hours or something, and you're either farming or you're taking trash, cleaning up the place, doing kind of the crap work but that everybody needs, or you're making clothes. You get the idea. All the subsistence things that the entire community needs. Part of your working day is, or pretty much the only time that you're actually working, is dedicated to stuff that your community needs, and then the rest of the day you do whatever the hell you want. So that's also an interesting. I thought that was an interesting idea when I first read that book. If I remember, we'll add it to the comments of this video. It's really good.
Yeah, and Harvey, I don't know if he mentions it in the lecture, but in the companion, he mentions that the capitalists attempt to raise efficiency and productivity in the labor process has been by introducing these quote unquote quality circles, and it's a way to add variety of tasking to kind of counteract that monotony of labor. And it's been this focus that a lot of capitalists and companies have attempted, because as we know, as it's been tested out in some companies, when the worker feels more valuable, I guess, then they end up being more productive when they feel like they're paid a fair wage, when they're getting benefits, when a good example is Ch.14 is one where they gave the other employees shares in the company, and this other guy that's active on Twitter.
The yogurt company?
The yogurt, yeah. I think they're kind of cooperative in the sense that they just give workers shares in the company. So, and then the other guy, Dan Price, which is this capitalist that's very active on Twitter and is CEO of some company, I forget what, that he raised all his employees' wages to a minimum of $15 an hour or something, and then he saw productivity.
Right. I think I've heard of that guy. I think I may follow him on Twitter, but
he has long hair.
He also he kind of capped his salary to
his own salary. He took a cut and then raised his workers' wages, and just by doing those simple things. But yeah, so Harvey just mentioned this attempt of these quality circles in order to decrease the monotony of work. So continuing, I already mentioned that in order to increase productivity even further, the capitalist also needs to make the tools more specialized. And Marx says on page 460, the productivity of labor depends not only on the proficiency of the worker, but also on the quality of his tools. So specializing both the workers and the tools leads to this fast and efficient manufacturing process. On 461, he says the specialized worker and his instruments are the simplest elements of manufacture. I don't think the sections, the way he lays out the sections in this chapter, are necessarily in any particular useful order. I think they could have been probably brought up in anywhere, with the exception of section 5, where he kind of like brings everything together. Because then in this next section, section 3, he distinguishes the two forms of manufacture as heterogeneous and organic. So these two forms of manufacture, heterogeneous is bringing together many skills, which is the carriage making that we gave an example of, that he actually gives an example of. And then the organic form of manufacture is the continuous form of production, where like he gives the example of like nail making, or like you're making paper or something like that.
That's interesting. I don't know. I feel like heterogeneous makes sense, but like organic, I don't see the word.
I don't know how. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Why is the word
like, organic
representing I'm doing the same thing over and over?
It may be like, I don't know. It may be like another one of those like fetishization things, like the way he uses fetishization. I mean, it kind of makes sense, but it's not like what we traditionally know it as. Organic, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's just some like 1800s way of using that word.
Yeah. So Marx talks about how productivity and efficiency depend not on necessarily the individual worker, but on the proper organization of collective work. And he recognizes that a major organizational aspect of the capitalist system is how space and time gets set up and understood. We mentioned in the Working Day chapter 10, on how the capitalist is increasingly attempting to increase the working day. So the capitalist kind of has this control, and they have to come up with this plan for an efficient, what Harvey calls a spatial temporal production system, which allows for specializing workers in the tools, allows for efficiency, but in doing that, you're decreasing the gaps in the working day. And if somebody's just working on the same thing all day, there's very little room for them to be doing anything else except that one task.
Yeah, like going back to kind of my example before about the context switching thing, I got an email recently, and what you just said reminded me of this email that I got at work recently that was like, use time boxing as a method to increase your productivity. And it was basically just like blocking out days to do specific things. Like take 1 hour of the day and just do your email, and take 1 hour of the day and do your programming, or whatever it is you do.
They're actually, since Warner Media bought out HBO and has been overseeing things now, they've actually been doing that for a while now.
Time boxing?
Not time boxing, but they give us our lunch hour, but they're also giving us like an extra, like I don't know if it's called time boxing, but an extra hour of break, like before our lunch hour. So we essentially have 2 free hours during the work.
Oh, wow, really? But then are you still only working? Well, do you normally work like 8 hours a day?
Yeah, it's an 8-hour day. You're not paid for lunch, so it's really a 9-hour day minus lunch. But now they're giving us like an hour of paid time to attend to personal issues and stuff like that.
Interesting.
I don't know if they're going to continue that when people start going back to the office, but it's kind of been something while people have been working remotely that they've been doing across all Warner Media properties.
Interesting.
So then, Marx continues in section 3, talking about how there's a hierarchy of labor powers. On 468 to 469, he says there's a hierarchy of labor powers to which there corresponds a scale of wages. Let me continue with another quote. He says, alongside the gradations of the hierarchy, there appears the simplest separation of the workers into skilled and unskilled. For the latter, the cost of apprenticeship, I can't say this word there. For the latter, I got it. Alongside the gradations of the hierarchy, there appears the simplest separation of the worker into skilled and unskilled. For the latter, the cost of apprenticeship vanishes. For the former, it diminishes compared with that required of the craftsman. In both cases, the value of labor power falls. So, he talks about how there's different skilled and unskilled labor positions, right? Laborers. And do you want to talk a little bit about this apprenticeship?
Yeah. This whole idea is, I found very interesting, and because essentially, by doing this whole division of labor, it kind of creates a caste system among the workers themselves, which is great for the capitalist, because he can pick and choose which workers he values more. And it also, even though they're all necessary to the overall process, he can pit the workers against each other instead of them focusing on the person who's exploiting them. And I thought this was a very interesting idea because if you're a worker of the unskilled caste, then you're mad. You're not necessarily mad at the capitalists. You're mad at your other workers who are like, taking, are like treated special, very special because they have more skill sets than you do or what have you. And it reminded me of this passage, which I'd like to read from this other book by Jack London called The Iron Heel. This is a fiction book, and it's really good. Its basic premises about this kind of future society or whatever that actually tries to accomplish a socialist revolution. So in it,
real quick, sorry, but Jack London was kind of he was born in 1876, but he was, and then died in 1916. I just see, but he was kind of in that era and kind of right. I'm not sure, and you're about to.
He was a big socialist.
He was a big socialist, and he wrote a lot about capitalism and the like. So.
Yeah. I think he wrote some nonfiction work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he wrote some nonfiction work specifically about this. As a kid, I knew him just because I read Call of the Wild and stuff like that.
Call of the Wild, yes, that's the book I remember reading.
Yeah. He's a big naturalist, very big naturalist too. But so getting back to this is kind of like his. It's a fiction book, but it reads almost like a pamphlet, like a socialist pamphlet, really. Like in it, the main character, Ernest Everhard, is kind of like trying to lead again the socialist revolution in this kind of, I want to say like it's in America, but it's like what's the term for it? Like an alternate future America or whatever. So I'll just read this because it's very pertinent to this whole idea of this caste system that I'm talking about. So and this is just they just successfully had a general strike. Okay, so he was able to get all of the workers together and actually do a general strike, which brought the whole society to a halt. The capitalists, which he refers to in the book, the Iron Heel, is the capitalist class, the oligarchy. So anyway, somebody asks him, the Iron Heel has learned its lesson. We showed it the power in the general strike. It has taken steps now to prevent another general strike. But how? Simply by subsidizing the great unions. They won't join in the next general strike, therefore it won't be a general strike. But the Iron Heel can't maintain so costly a program forever. Oh, it hasn't subsidized all the unions. That's not necessary. Here is what is going to happen. Wages are going to be advanced and hours shortened in the railroad unions, the iron and steel worker union, and the engineer and machinist union. And these unions, more favorable conditions will continue to prevail. Membership in these unions will become like seats in paradise. And then he kind of goes on, and then eventually he's this other paragraph. He goes, but what the guy who's questioning him asks, but what about coal? There are nearly 1 million coal miners. And then he responds, they are practically unskilled labor. They will not count. Their wages will go down and their hours will increase. They will be slaves like all the rest of us, and they will become about the most bestial of all of us. They will be compelled to work, just as the farmers are compelled to work now for the masters who rob them of their land, and the same with all the other unions outside the combination. Watch them wobble and go to pieces, and their members become slaves driven to toil by empty stomachs and the law of the land. So I thought that was really good because it captures this whole idea of like what ends up happening is that the workers that are more skilled end up kind of like banding together and like, well, shit, we got to protect ourselves. So like, let's make the deal with the capitalists and break the strike. You know what I'm saying? Meanwhile, this huge swath of people that are quote unquote unskilled get fucked over essentially.
Yeah.
And it's all to the benefit of this method of production.
Yeah. Nice. Cool. This is a good outside context, little example.
Yeah, man. I had read this last year, and then when we were reading this chapter, and then we were going to do it, it reminded me of it, and I was like, this is good content.
Yeah, for sure. So that's basically it for section 3. He ends it by saying everything that shortens the necessary labor time required for the reproduction of labor power extends the domain of surplus labor. Yeah, so basically capitalist reorganizations and reconfigurations of tasks tend to produce de-skilling as tasks that were once complicated become simplified into these component parts. So section 4, called the division of labor in manufacture and the division of labor in society. So Marx here returns to the distinction between the detailed division of labor in the workshop, which occurs specifically under the capitalist mode of production. And then there's also the division of labor achieved through competition in the market. So what does this mean? He calls this division of labor, which forms the foundation of all commodity production, which can exist throughout all modes of economic systems, is the social division of labor. So it's basically the natural division of labor that arises when wanting to produce something, right? It's the basic form of commodity production. So Marx gives this example of creating a pair of shoes. So one person needs to raise the cattle, one person tans the leather, and then another person sews the leather and makes the shoes. So basically everyone in the supply chain is creating their own commodity that they exchange for money. And the social division of labor, which I was just describing, precedes the division of labor in manufacture. So his central point here is that the division of labor in manufacture assumes that society has already attained a certain degree of development. He says that on page 473. Steve, is there anything?
No, sorry.
Okay.
No, I have nothing.
Okay.
I have no thoughts.
It's pretty straightforward. I mean, he doesn't give the best historical context. I
guess all I could say there is, I think his point there was just like, the capitalists didn't invent divisions of labor, right? Like it was like people from, and he uses the example of indigenous societies, have had this kind of concept kind of built in, because whenever you kind of get a bunch of people together in one place, you're going to say, so-and-so, you fish. Hey, so-and-so, you're going to go gather, fruit today, and you are going to stay here. And it's going to naturally do that, because if not, it's like, what, you're banding together as a small village, and, Neolithic farmers didn't have this whole concept of like, well, I'm going to try to do everything by myself. They recognized doing everything by themselves mostly didn't help them in their survival. It was much more beneficial for them to kind of divvy up tasks. The difference is that, I'm all about divvying up tasks, but we're all coming back and sharing what we did. And instead of what's happening now, where it's like the work is getting all divided, but we're not all sharing in the spoils, right? That's the main crux of the thing.
Yeah, so he's saying the social division of labor arises naturally versus the division of labor in manufacture, which is not natural, right? The specialized worker doesn't produce any individual commodity, and there's no currency exchange within the manufacturing process or changing hands. It's all planned and organized and overseen by the capitalists, and which makes the division of labor in manufacture unique to capitalism. It's a way of creating surplus value at the expense of the worker, which then he kind of lays out in more detail in section 5, called the capitalist character of manufacture, which basically summarizes everything. Basically, capitalists wish to discourage any imagination and they wish to make the worker more machine-like, right? And Harvey asks in his companion, to what degree do our ordinary employments corrupt the courage of our minds? And Marx says in 484, some crippling of body and mind is inseparable even from the division of labor in society as a whole. So this is kind of a key point in that really workers don't really have any time to think about, let alone read about, let alone do what we're doing and reading capital. Especially people that work multiple jobs, they need to make ends meet, they need to feed their children, put food on the table, everything. Given their working class position, they're so busy trying to make money that they don't have time for anything outside of work, right? So that's kind of how the capitalist mode of production discourages any imagination or desire for revolt or anything, right? Because everybody's just trying to make that bread.
Everybody's just trying to, survive. Yeah, it crushes you outside of work and it crushes you within work, right? We just described how it kind of crushes you within work because you don't, since you're kind of only required to do one thing over and over again. There's no room for creativity there, or not as much room, right? Human beings are pretty, they're pretty ingenious, and they'll come up with ways to make even a monotonous task more creative or easier. But at the end of the day, if you're only really allowed to be in a certain box, there's only so much you can do.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think this chapter is section is kind of is just kind of a compilation, a summary of everything that he's been talking about. In the first part of it, he reiterates the whole idea of the worker who is a master of a whole craft can find a means of subsistence anywhere, but when you are a manufacturing worker or a specialized worker, you only can find subsistence when you're connected to a factory, or connected to a bunch of other people, because you only know how to make wheels, you don't know how to make a whole carriage, so you are stuck in that, and you are beholden. You're beholden to the laws that the society makes around that, and also the capitalist who's obviously employing you. That's one of the things I took out of here. And the other thing I took out of here, the main thing, was the idea that you touched upon at the end, which is that it really kind of like dumbs you down. Unfortunately, it kind of like dumbs you down, and it kills your spirit in a way. And I thought, but it's on purpose. It's by not allowing you the ability to learn a variety of different things, you don't have the time, or you don't have the capacity to think about like your position in society. Like, you don't have to think about like what you were just saying, like, okay, well, what kind of organization have we created here, and like, what is my place in it, and what is it that we're all trying to accomplish, like the greater kind of idea of what we're all doing. You're just trying to put food on the table, man. So it's like, you don't have the ability to. And one thing I want to read in here, which I found always great, is when Marx throws in those little Adam Smith quotes, because people love Adam Smith, we're on the other side of the fence, but the guy had a lot to kind of shit to say about the capitalism and stuff. And one of the things he says here on page 43, Adam Smith says, the uniformity of his stationary life naturally corrupts the courage of his mind. His dexterity at his own particular trade seems in this manner to be acquired at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues. But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state in which the laboring poor, that is the great body of the people, must necessarily fall. So he's basically talking about how, he's pointing out that the poor people are the ones that usually suffer from these things. It isn't everybody in the capitalist society. It's just the poor people that end up getting screwed over, both in kind of in their mental and emotional life, and also, financially, by getting screwed over.
Yeah, that's actually the quote that Harvey brings up, and maybe you heard it in the lecture, that he raises the question, to what degree do our ordinary employments corrupt the courage of our minds? And that that leads into like what I was discussing. People are working so long, and they get home and they just want to chill. They don't want to go learn about, like, they don't want to read Capital, and they don't want to question their state of being and stuff. So
yeah, that's kind of what inspired us to kind of do this, is that we understand that we're kind of we're one of those privileged workers who have the ability to do this in the free time to do this, and so
thankfully we only work one job, even though sometimes your job carries over into the weekend, but thankfully we're working single jobs, or our jobs are flexible enough that we don't have to get off one shift and go work a night shift somewhere, which not everybody has the luxury for.
Absolutely.
So kind of just to wrap things up, Marx, this last part of Capital in this last chapter was again about the division of labor and manufacture, and kind of focusing a lot on the worker. In chapter 14, at the end of chapter 14, Marx says on page 491, he concludes it by saying, "It is machines that abolish the role of the handicraftsman as the regulating principle of social production," which will lead us into chapter 15, which we'll discuss in our next video, which is all about machinery and large-scale industry. It's a long one, and we'll have a lot to discuss. Until next time, unless you have something else to say, Steve, if not, say
no, man.
Bye to everybody.
This last chapter, this 15th chapter is so big, so long. We're probably going to make 2 videos out of it. So
possibly.
Catch us then.
Awesome. Yeah. Later.